Hello, everybody. Good evening here in New York and Washington and places as well. I'm Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association. And we thought several weeks ago that things were hotting up in the Sahara, if you'll forgive me saying so. And the Western Sahara issue has been on the back burner for a long time, and it looks like it's now moved forward. So we began the preparations for this webinar press conference, and we hope you will ask questions on it. This has been, what, 40 years in the making, minimum. And we have Jacob Mundy, who has been working with human rights organizations, is at Colgate University now, looking at the implications of this struggle. He's helped write a book about it. And one of the things that's really important, I mean, I should mention, I feel I'm part of history as a correspondent at the United Nations. Back at the beginning of all of this, I was at the press conference when the Swiss diplomat Jacob Mundy announced that they'd reached a ceasefire between Polisario and Algeria. And he said it was all going to be over in a year because they had the Spanish census records, which were the basis for the voting rolls, and they could go ahead and have an immediate referendum on self-determination. And I remember, it is not a recovered memory, it's a genuine memory, it's in the minutes there. I asked, have you told the Moroccans that it's going to be over in a year? Does the King of Morocco know that he's going to let people vote? And he said, well, of course, it's in the agreement. And 40 years later, it's in that agreement, and it's in 3 or 4 other agreements since then. And there still hasn't been a referendum. And the UN is spending, I think it's 50 million a year on MINERSO to conduct a referendum that the government of Morocco seems to show no inclination whatsoever to have. So it's a complicated, but in some ways it's very simple. The only complication is that nobody's prepared to enforce the resolutions on the Moroccans. So Jacob, can you give us a rundown on, well, let's take it from now. What's the current situation and how did we get to where we are now in the sand dunes?
Well, for the Polisario, the Western Saharan liberation movement, the ceasefire is over. So the 1991 ceasefire is dead as far as they're concerned. They're conducting military operations against Moroccan positions along the Moroccan defensive wall inside Western Sahara. This is the first major ceasefire breach we've seen, active fighting. My dog's making an appearance, so he's gonna walk around back there. So the situation we have is the most serious one we've had since 1991, and this is because there was a civilian protest at the checkpoint between Mauritania and Morocco. This is the only road leading between the Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara and Mauritania. It's the major thoroughfare linking Europe to West Africa. Civilians had blocked it. It's been a source of tension for many years, but especially since 2016, because Morocco wanted to pave the road, which effectively meant crossing from Moroccan-controlled territory within the UN ceasefire zone into Polisario-controlled territory, and especially something called the buffer strip, which is it's the red card as far as UN ceasefire violations go. And so Morocco pushed in there, tried to pave a road, and Polisario began protesting in 2016. And then on October 20th of this year, we saw the civilian presence protesting, which halted all traffic going north and south. So you had thousands, if not millions of dollars of goods and produce and fish rotting in the desert while these Sahrawis were protesting the violation of their sovereignty as they saw it. So Morocco cleared that out on Friday, and Polisario had said, this is a red line. If you crack down on these protesters, we're going to resume war. And that's exactly what they did. And so Saturday, the war is back on.
So the protesters were protesting the Moroccans paving a road?
That and other sorts of provocative actions in the buffer strip, but really to kind of say many things. Among them, one, to protest the illegal exploitation of natural resources in the territory, particularly the rich fishing off the coast, to protest Moroccan efforts to link Western Sahara to West Africa through trade, as if that doesn't create new facts on the ground, which are technically in violation of the UN ceasefire. There's not supposed to be these infrastructural enhancements on the ground, particularly infrastructural enhancements that would benefit Morocco, and to say that, you know, these infrastructural enhancements, the road was happening on Sahrawi territory, which, according to the ICJ, is sovereign for the Western Saharans.
Yeah. Could I ask you to be careful about your microphone?
Okay.
You're rustling it. It's coming on.
Oh, okay.
But no, we should perhaps explain to people that this strip of land, that Mauritania to the south of Western Sahara also claimed a goodly chunk of Western Sahara, but gave up its claim when Polisario beat them on the battlefield, effectively. And then the Moroccans accepted the Mauritanian claim originally, but then decided they'd inherited the whole claim afterwards. So this is a tiny strip of territory between the Moroccan-controlled section of Western Sahara and Mauritania. And as you said, it's the major thoroughfare through to West Africa from Europe. So isn't this where the United Nations should have come in and said, we will provide United Nations white painted bulldozers and we will do the road for everybody?
One would think that in a normal world that would be the way you'd want to go about doing this, that if you could demonstrate that it's to the benefit of the population to have these infrastructural enhancements and that they could be done in a cooperative fashion, not in a unilateral fashion, then yes, of course, but that's not how it's done, and that's certainly not how Morocco does it. I mean, Morocco did a very similar action in 2001 when the Paris-Dakar rally was crossing through Western Sahara. And they moved into the buffer strip to clear out mines so that the race could cross into Polisario held territory. And that was the last time, nearly 20 years ago, when we came very close to war. But it took high-level intervention from the Algerian military to say, you know, please don't do this. We would like to, you know, see the peace process work. And so Polisario pulled back. But again, it was a Moroccan provocation that really pushed them towards the edge.
So, you know, from one point of view, this boil has been festering for 40 years now. And it reminds me of Cyprus amongst several other UN determined ceasefires that seem to perpetuate the conflict in perpetuity. Is this likely to lead to some type of resolution of the issues?
Well, I've always thought that the Western Sahara issue wasn't going to get any attention unless it became the squeaky wheel that needs the grease, and that really it would take a crisis, not only, you know, in the territory, but a crisis that would begin to impinge upon Western interests vis-a-vis Morocco. So far, it doesn't seem that we're at that level yet, and it would maybe take a significant escalation by Polisario. So far, we've heard nothing from Morocco. Morocco is pretending like nothing's happening in the territory, or at least the media is. So we don't know in terms of casualties, damages against the wall, that sort of thing. The UN ceasefire monitors are in the area. They haven't issued any statements or that sort of thing. So we don't know. But one assumes that, you know, only a crisis will solve the situation. But now we're going to have to figure out how much of a crisis will it take to solve this situation.
Well, you mentioned that the United Nations monitors haven't said much. That's been one of the characteristics of the last 30 years is United Nations monitors very rarely say anything much that's likely to offend the Moroccans and their sponsors, like the French. They tend to go along with the status quo, and you know, officials have been bribed. I know this by personal experience and reportage. To keep quiet and produce a pro-Moroccan version. But essentially, the United Nations is not in the game. The Secretary General issued a mumbled, mealy-mouthed statement that basically ignored the key issue, that he is in charge of an institution that called for a referendum 40 years ago, and it's not happened and isn't happening.
Yeah, and the breaking of the ceasefire highlights an important fact about the UN mission in Western Sahara, which is when it was originally designed, the ceasefire was one step in the process that would lead to self-determination. And when Perez de Cuellar declared the ceasefire unilaterally without consulting Polisario, but with consulting Morocco in 1991, this decoupled the ceasefire from that process, right? So Johann Mons thought, you know, as a good Swiss technocrat, he thought, oh yeah, we can do this in 9 months. That's what it says on paper, and that's the agreement, right? But one of the things that the ceasefire actually did was it disrupted the peace plan in Western Sahara and allowed this decoupling of the referendum process from the ceasefire process. And now that MINURSO has become entirely institutionalized within DPKO, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which has been French-led for many years, right? That it's now viewed as a part of the international peacekeeping apparatus. And they don't want to disturb MINURSO's existence by pointing out the fact that, one, it can't complete the mission it's supposed to. Two, never mind the fact that it's the only UN mission that doesn't monitor human rights. And three, it's apparently not even good at keeping the peace in the territory anyway.
That's a crucial one. I mean, this is interesting because I think one of the few things that we can do with the UN is to name and shame. So yeah. This is the only peacekeeping operation with no human rights component.
Yeah.
And this isn't an oversight, I presume you're going to tell us.
No. There was an effort under the Obama administration to even push it through, but the diplomatic outrage that Morocco projected was quite extensive. And they did an end run around the U.S. State Department and went straight to the Pentagon, which has become the more important institutional relationship between Morocco and the United States than the Department of State in many ways. And so that whole thing was shelved, and we haven't seen efforts to add human rights monitoring since then.
Yeah, so it's a bad precedent for UN peacekeeping as a whole, but very particularly for this. And the interesting bit, you mentioned it here with the Pentagon, is that this is to some extent a bipartisan issue, because John Bolton has shown signs of interest and favoritism. He doesn't like UN peacekeeping missions in general, but he opposes this one because it's a waste and because he thinks there should be a referendum to get it over with, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, he definitely wants a solution. He doesn't want a mission on the books that's not able to fulfill its mandate. Even looking further right, if that's possible, you have James Inhofe in the U.S. Senate, who's maybe the only congressional official that I can think of who's issued a very forceful denunciation of Morocco's provocations in Guergarat.
That was this week he did, didn't he?
Yeah.
But looking back further in history, we were discussing just before, one of my favorite quotes in that orotund congressional style was of where the Americans came in on this, that the Polisario and the Sahrawis were victims of Cold War politics back in the 60s and 70s. You got the quote from me. Can you regale everybody with the quote from the UN ambassador of the time, Ambassador Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who sounds, I mean, as you hear it, you can imagine him standing on a stump holding forth.
Well, I wish my colleague Stephen Zun is much better at reciting it verbatim. The paraphrase is that when East Timor was invaded in 1975 and Morocco invaded Western Sahara in 1975, the U.S. policy was to make sure that the Security Council proved utterly ineffective in opposing these invasions, and I carried forth this duty with no inconsiderable success.
I was not unsuccessful in that regard.
Yeah.
I think if I can
something of
stand
that
in for Steve.
Right. Yeah. So Morocco is certainly indebted to the United States for keeping the Security Council from opposing very strongly what was an act of aggression. That Morocco said to Spain, if you don't allow our 350,000 marchers to cross into the territory to reclaim it, we're going to use military force. I mean, that was the ultimatum that was presented to a Spanish cabinet that was in utter disarray because Franco had just collapsed into a coma.
Let's walk back here. You mentioned the famous Green March. Not everybody knows about that. If you can explain what happened.
Yeah, well, the Green March was basically Morocco's plan to get Western Sahara from Spain. Spain was a late colonizing power who didn't invest much in Western Sahara until the very end when they found rich phosphate deposits. Finally, they relented international pressure and began preparing to give the territory independence through a self-determination referendum. possibly hoping to pass it off to a sympathetic pro-Madrid party. But the Polisario independence movement had already proven by 1975 to be the most popular among the Sahrawis. Morocco stupidly had put the question to the International Court of Justice with Mauritania in tow, whether or not they had historical sovereign rights to the territory. And the verdict is very interesting because it not only says Morocco has almost no basis for a historical claim, but that if you look at who was actually sovereign in 1885, when the territory was initially colonized by Spain or claimed, that the Sahrawis themselves were socially and politically organized to such a degree that they were the sovereign power. Right. So the court not only said, these people deserve self-determination, but they had sovereignty at the time of colonization. So what does Morocco do? Hours later, the King of Morocco says, I'm going to march 350,000 civilians into the Spanish Sahara to reclaim it for Morocco. And if Spain opposes this, we'll use the military troops that are already massed along the border. And again, the Spanish cabinet was in disarray. The Kissinger State Department was quite keen to see this happen. I got documents declassified that showed that Kissinger had already been tipped off by the CIA in early October, a month ahead of time, that this was going to happen. And a former US ambassador to Algeria told me that the United States National Security Council had possibly received advanced plans for the Green March, maybe as much as a year in advance through General Vernon Walters.
I've heard it alleged that part of the trade-off here was the Moroccans laid off on the Spanish enclaves in Morocco, in return for being given a free hand in the Sahara. You got any further comment on that?
Well, there were elements of the Madrid Accords that were secrets. The agreement that basically, where Spain said, okay, we're going to leave the territory within a few months and then hand it over to Morocco and Mauritania. The Moroccan-Mauritanian division was later decided in 1976. But the issue of Ceuta and Melilla is always one that has never been settled, and Morocco continues to bring it up anytime that there's a diplomatic fracas between Rabat and Madrid, as well as the issue of migrants, drugs, and free trade.
But they certainly don't prosecute it or besiege it or pursue it with any great vigor, apart from every now and again waving a flag about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, but it makes for great sort of nationalist rabble rousing to claim that, we still don't have full sovereignty over our country.
To make the sort of claims the Spanish make about Gibraltar, in fact, which I've always found deliciously ironic.
Yeah. They could be treated as an interlocking problem.
Yeah. Now, from your assessment of it, I mean, there's no doubt that in the early days, the Polisario was a somewhat hardline Leninist organization. Even if it had popular support, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. Has it evolved in any way? They've been in the desert now for 40, 50 years. So has Polisario, have the Saharans in the camps developed in a social way? And what are their relations with what probably is a majority now of Saharans inside the territory, in the occupied territory itself?
Yeah. Well, an effect of the Moroccan invasion in 1975 was the split between the population. That 40% went to the refugee camps and the rest stayed under Moroccan occupation. Since then, the camps have blossomed into a population of about 180,000, according to the last UNHCR count that's been available. Polisario, was founded by young student radicals, as well as other elements of Sahrawi society. The current president of the Sahrawi Republic in exile, the Secretary General Polisario, he was a military officer in the Spanish colonial army, who brought with him some experience when he joined Polisario. But you also had students who, in the milieu of Nasserism, Che Guevara, that sort of thing. Ironically, where they encountered this was on Moroccan campuses. At the same time, Polisario is a political front, which means they try to incorporate as many political ideologies as possible. And as they've aged, the sort of anti-tribalism, the secular vision has softened. The founders of Polisario are themselves now sheikhs, esteemed elders within the society, the very figures that they once rebelled against as youths. So it's Polisario is often characterized as a one-party state, but what it is a political organization that attempts to contain within it, for the sake of national unity, various divisions. So you have Islamist type visions of society, Muslim Brotherhood type visions, all the way to more leftist visions that are sympathetic with Chavez and the pink tide in Latin America.
And what are their relations with the people actually under occupation? Because I think almost surprising is the fact that one of the reasons why the Moroccans will not hold a referendum seems to be that the people under occupation consider themselves under occupation and show no signs of voting the way the king wants them to in any referendum.
What's the saying? Don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. That was the thing, that when Morocco was willing to hold a referendum, they were willing to hold a referendum so long as they could control the outcome, and that meant trying to stuff the voter polls with Moroccans pretending to be Western Saharans. So the reason it didn't take 9 months to hold a referendum, and it actually took 9 years to count the population, is because out of a final voter list of 86,000, you had over 200,000 that were questionable applications that had to be vetted personally, including in Morocco proper. That more voters were vetted inside Morocco than inside Western Sahara.
And was there any justification for those claims? Ancestral, tribal, or I went there on holiday 1 year, so I should be allowed to vote.
Yeah.
What type of excuses were there?
Well, the saying that colonial boundaries are arbitrary yet sacrosanct. Well, the arbitrariness did where the northern border with Western Sahara, as well as the Algerian border and the Mauritanian border, did bisect tribes. And there were even Mauritanians or Sahrawis in Mauritania who qualified to vote. Now, there were a small handful. And there were a number of Sahrawis, due to the presence of Sahrawi tribes in southern Morocco, that also qualified for the referendum, but not the numbers that Morocco pretended. So it's interesting that Morocco became increasingly uninterested in the referendum, not only when King Hassan died and the notorious interior minister, Driss Basri, was quickly ejected by the new king, but also once they realized that they weren't going to be able to fool the UN and present hundreds of thousands of Moroccans posing as Sahrawis. Like it just wasn't going to happen. But even the Security Council kind of understood that the game was up. And in the wake of East Timor, the Security Council pulled the plug on the referendum and said, we need a political solution, because it's going to come to this point where it's pretty embarrassing where Morocco loses a referendum and doesn't leave the territory.
Well, it's interesting to put it there with Western Sahara and East Timor, because the two often come together. It's looking at the years that they spent under occupation, it's an oblique testimony to the UN, the fact that the occupation was never internationally recognized because the UN wouldn't recognize them. I mean, that's what helped East Timor. I think most people in the world, apart from a few Timorese, had given up on their claim almost. It was there legally, but inapplicable, because the Indonesians put as much effort and force into it as the Moroccans did. But it went. East Timor is now independent, thriving and prosperous, by the way. But what about Western Sahara? I mean, how strong that there's a real dichotomy. The African Union recognizes Sahrawi independence, but the Arab world in general doesn't, with few exceptions.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, if you talk to Sahrawi diplomats and Timorese diplomats in the mid-90s, and you said, which country by the end of the decade will be independent? And you tallied up the scorecards, the number of states that had recognized Western Sahara, the recognition with the Organization of African Unity, and later the African Union, those sorts of things, as well as the existence of a UN mission for the referendum in Western Sahara, when, such a thing with East Timor still wasn't even being really envisaged until after the Asian financial collapse. And so everyone thought East Timor was, not was going to be the forgotten lost conflict. And then in 1999, each conflict goes in entirely different directions. Once King Hassan II dies, really the referendum died with him.
Well, we have some interest. Michael Beer wants you to talk about Algeria's role and the political situation between Algeria, Western Sahara, and Morocco.
Yeah, Algeria has hosted the Sahrawi refugees since 1976. Algeria wasn't initially interested in supporting Polisario's cause. Polisario had to go to Libya and other countries. Algeria became more interested in supporting Polisario's cause once they had seen that Western powers had connived to, from their point of view, redraw the map of North Africa. And that's when full-throated Algerian support fell behind Polisario, was after the drama on the Security Council, the drama with Spain, and Morocco getting their territory by force rather than through a referendum. And so Algeria was the #1 military supporter of Polisario, as well as in terms of humanitarian aid, has offered diplomatic support abroad, and has continued to be a steadfast supporter of Polisario. But it certainly isn't the case that, what you read in the Moroccan press, that Polisario is a bunch of ragtag militias used by Algeria just to menace Morocco. That Polisario and the Western Sahara nationalist movement would exist whether or not, Algeria supported them.
Could you keep on watching your mic, please?
Yeah.
It's a minefield out there. Well, Michael Beer also followed on with this. It's a good point. What is the internal situation in Morocco? Now, in Indonesia, I haven't heard any crocodile tears even about the loss of East Timor. It seems to have gone off, without political consequences for the parties in Jakarta, that they lost the territory that they invested so much in. Is there any type of movement in Morocco that would support the Sahrawis? Because you sometimes get the impression it's a bit like talking to an Indian about Kashmir, or many people in India about Kashmir, and normal issues of human rights and self-determination go out the window. And you often get the impression that this is the case with Morocco, or is it simply that there's so much repression in Morocco that nobody dares speak up either way about the Sahara?
Yeah, there's a few things there. Historically, marginal political parties have supported Western Saharan independence, mostly on the far left. But you've had statements from more extreme radical Islamists who've also said, how could one blame the Sahrawis for not wanting to live under an apostate like the Moroccan monarch, things of that sort. But yeah, the problem, as one Moroccan journalist put it to me in Morocco, is that they've never been allowed to have free speech or debate about the issue of Western Sahara. So that's why you don't find a diversity of opinion. There is no question of Western Sahara for most Moroccans. I was chatting with a couple of anthropologists who work in entirely different contexts, and they were sort of saying, Moroccans will tell the dirtiest jokes about their king that you can imagine. But when you ask them about Western Sahara, they're sort of perplexed as to that's even an issue. I don't understand.
It's so it's not out of just fear. They just take it as axiomatic.
Well, yeah, since the 1950s, from Moroccan textbooks to the media to the statements of the king, this is an unquestioned faith, and it's a part of national identity as far as Moroccans are concerned. This attachment to a territory that most have never been to.
Yeah, and so far it's been low cost for them. It's not as though they've had a long war of attrition with bodies littering the desert as a result of it. I suppose you mentioned before about squeaky wheels. There's no squeakiness in the wheel here.
Well, it was difficult, especially when the war wasn't going Morocco's way in the late 70s and the early 1980s. If not for generous aid from Saudi Arabia and then rescue packages from the IMF, which led to bloody bread riots in the early and mid 1980s. Right, the Moroccan economy was a mess because of this incredibly expensive war in Western Sahara. So in many ways, you could say that the UN ceasefire has allowed this low cost picture to emerge within Morocco, that holding on to Western Sahara has been much less expensive in terms of blood and treasure.
We have a suggestion from somebody who I know, it's coming up on the board here, who I know did work in the area in Mineso. Suggests that some of the Polisario might be interested in presenting themselves as more reliable and important allies to the US than Morocco.
Well, this has generally been my critique of US counterterrorism policy in the region, is that we've liaised with governments who are at war with peoples in their periphery. So if you look at what happened in Mali when the state collapsed in 2012 and you got an Islamic State type affiliate in the north of the country, Mali was the poster child of US counterterrorism policy during the global war on terror. And what did that policy do? Well, it apparently trained soldiers who couldn't fight and who were very good at overthrowing their government. We have the same thing in Western Sahara, which is, who are the real stakeholders in Saharan security? Well, I think it's first of all the people who live there, right? So why is the United States partnering with governments who are at war with populations in their peripheries?
Well, yes, that's a perennial question, isn't it? We have somebody here. Is it Howard Jackson or Jackson Howard says, this isn't a sarcastic question. Has Morocco ever been reproached in any way by the UN other than statements calling for restraint from both sides? And he's remembering previous incidents during the Arab Spring, because it does tend to be the UN reaction when faced with a strong wrongdoer and a weak victim. You call for restraint on both sides. It's a perennial pattern, and it seems to be, well, it was replicated last week in the statement from the Secretary General about the impending possibility of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think the statements that the Security Council issued in 1975, even as weak as they are, as Moynihan explained to us, that those are the strongest statements we've seen in terms of denouncing the Green March and calling for Morocco to withdraw from the territory. Since then, besides General Assembly resolutions, maybe things coming out of the Human Rights Council, we haven't seen a lot in terms of condemnation.
Do you anticipate any?
Coming soon? I don't know. I don't know how long is it going to take for the Security Council to react to the fact that one of the oldest ceasefires on the planet has suddenly collapsed. You'd think they would have done so by now.
Well, one of the other questions at the moment is, was it an accident the Moroccans chose now to do the provocation, or did they wait until they knew there was no hand on the tiller in Washington? Or if there was a hand on the tiller, it was somebody who was completely capricious and might well end up supporting them.
Yeah, there's a lot of news out there, a lot of reports. The UAE told them to do it, things like that. What I think was really happening though was the economic pressure was building up on Morocco with all of these trucks and trucks and trucks building up at the border because of this nonviolent protest that was blockading the economic activity. Even somewhere as remote as that, it's still a significant amount of trade that goes through. Vegetable prices in the markets in Mauritania were through the roof due to a scarcity premium. So I think it was partially that. Maybe Morocco was waiting for the outcome of the U.S. election. Morocco is certainly worried about who the next Secretary of State might be. Not that they've had great relations with the Trump administration. They haven't been bad, but they certainly haven't been coddled in the way that they were, especially under the Clinton Secretary of State.
So going back to the trucks being held up, was this a spontaneous local demonstration of irate Sahrawis? Well, much to be irate about, or was it a cunning plot by Polisario to light the fuse?
Well, I don't think Polisario's intent was to start a new war, but I think there was definitely, I'll just say, a cry for help that we were approaching the annual, what it feels like the ritual renewal of the UN mission in Western Sahara. where we get a very dry report from the Secretary General and we get a very meaningless resolution from the Security Council. That's now been happening in October every year. We've been without a personal envoy that is a lead negotiator for over, I think, about a year and a half at this point. The peace process is rudderless without a sail, and the Security Council is acting like there's no urgency. So civilian demonstration blocking trade into Morocco and Western Sahara and Mauritania would be quite an effective and tactically advantageous measure to get that attention and to call attention to issues like gross ceasefire violations of changing facts on the ground to benefit economically.
Well, of course, there is if there's a vacancy, there's a candidate. John Bolton has experience in this area and seems to be unemployed at the moment. Do you think it might be a way to get him out the way for a Biden administration? John, you know this area. Go to the desert.
Well, I don't think he'll be a personal envoy. One of the things that's happened in the peace process is that the parties can now accept or reject the personal envoy at will. And so finding the right personality to even fit the bill has become an incredibly arduous task. Moroccans no longer trust Americans after the experience with James Baker and Chris Ross. And Polisario doesn't trust anyone who's not strong enough to actually do anything. So who fits that bill?
Mm-hmm. We saw while we're still on American politics, Senator Inhofe. Did he have a beach holiday on the Sahara or something? Often U.S. legislators move in mysterious ways, influenced by personal circumstances. Any idea what his personal circumstances were that make him such a proponent?
Well, Polisario has always been interested in cultivating bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. Especially operating in the Reagan years, right? You couldn't get very far if you were just supported by Ted Kennedy, and so they've always reached out to that libertarian side of the U.S. Congress, also that side that is often critical of the United Nations, but more importantly, to try to find allies in different ways, and in many ways, like with South Sudan, to even look to churches, that you have evangelical churches that are active in the Sahrawi refugee camps as aid organizations, running education, teaching English, things of that sort. So Polisario is not only talking to the Spanish left or things like that, right? They have.
Well, I happen to know that they were quite close. That they spoke often to Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, who is not part of the libertarian right by any means.
Exactly. No, and if you look at their support in Latin America, right, it's both right and left.
Mm-hmm. So where can we go from here? I mean, one other. Everyone talks about the US and as though it's the be all and end all, but the EU has significant leverage in its trade dealings with Morocco, and we've already had European court judgments that the Moroccans can't the Moroccans can't just sell the Saharis fish for them, and they can't sell the phosphates. There have been cargoes were confiscated in South Africa coming from Western Sahara as stolen goods. So to what extent has the boycott and disinvestment side of this got any legs, and what part will the European Union play on that?
Well, I think that's been the most exciting thing to happen in recent years, considering the fact that the peace process has been, killed many times over at this point. But you see it in the European court system, and the case in Pretoria and elsewhere, the fact that when Western Sahara takes its case to international legal fora, it almost never loses, because the international law aspect of this conflict is, couldn't be any more clear when it comes, especially with the opinion of the ICJ. I mean, you just look at UN documents. Year after year, the UN Fourth Committee on Decolonization produces a list of the non-self-governing territories in the world, and there's Western Sahara, and Morocco's not even listed as the colonizing power. So what's strange about the EU is that they keep trying to revive these free trade deals, even in the face of repeated court decisions saying, no, you can't actually do that.
Well, there's something very Trumpian in the Moroccan response sometimes, because they will take an ICJ judgment saying, no, you don't have sovereign right, and put it on their papers, say, this court backs Morocco's claim, even though it says exactly the opposite. So, you know,
Yeah.
we are in a sort of psychopathic, well, a sociopathic mindset.
Yeah, they're certainly dogged, I'll just say that.
Well, what's Polisario isn't here. To what extent do they represent the people in the, they seem to be more successfully than I would have thought, represent the people under occupation as well as the people out in the camps. Is that your impression as well?
Well, it's difficult to say. You look at Reporters Without Borders reports on Western Sahara, being one of the most restricted places on earth. Freedom House, consistently rates it among the worst of the worst repressive regimes on the planet. So we don't know.
This is the Moroccan regime in the territory.
Yeah, the occupied territories, we just don't know. It's an information black hole most of the time. The internet helps. We find things and we see things that we never saw before. We can talk to people, but we don't know what political opinions are. There are elements that are, we could call loyalist Sahrawis, who are fealty to the Moroccan kingdom and that sort, but there's also a silent majority that we have no idea. And I think the fact that Morocco is unwilling to hold a referendum, even James Baker, his final proposal said, okay, let's let Moroccan settlers, who are now the majority in the territory, let's let them vote as well. And even then, under those conditions, Morocco wouldn't go for it.
There've been other suggestions. In fact, I made one some years ago, and I was invited to South Africa to talk about it. I never got there. It's the idea of looking at, if this, as I understand it, the Moroccan claim was based not upon the Moroccan state, but the Moroccan royal family, that the tribes owed duties of fealty to him. So is there any position of doing a sort of British Commonwealth thing where the King of Morocco flies in once a year and everyone waves a flag and then sends him back again afterwards? That he's the King of Western Sahara as well, but he lets them look like the Australians and the New Zealanders look after their own affairs. Are these, let me say, imaginative constitutional proposals that would save face for all parties feasible?
Well, feasible, possibly. The problem is Morocco just won't negotiate. I mean, that's Morocco's policy since 2007 has been we're not negotiating. Morocco has put on the table what they view as the most that they can give, and this is what the king has said repeatedly, that the 2007 autonomy proposal is the most we can give. Now, the autonomy proposal doesn't even count as autonomy under international law, because real autonomy, you can't have a central government abrogate the local government, but the Moroccan king can't. That's like, when you're an absolute monarch, giving away that power is pretty serious. So Morocco has no interest, because at this point all they have is more to lose in terms of sovereignty. Yeah, there's a world of possibilities, from Commonwealth to asymmetric federation to really enhanced autonomy, to devolution, to use British words, right? But if you can't even explore those imaginative models because one party to the conflict is just stonewalling negotiations, well, then nothing's going to happen.
Now, in Morocco, there's a sizable Berber population, which is not always in love with the king and the central government. Are the Berbers a presence in the Sahara at all?
In some ways, there are, particularly among the merchant class, that Berbers have moved in to fill in some of the economic niches and things of that sort. The sort of, depending on how you look at it, three main Berber populations in Morocco. And the one that has been really interesting in recent years is in the north of the country, where you've seen very large protests challenging the authority of the regime and even raising the flag of the Reef Republic, which was a short-lived breakaway state at the time when northern Morocco was under Spanish control. And that flag has come out in protests. And the idea of a Reefian state has sort of come back from the dead. And so this sort of Moroccan rhetoric about, well, if you give Western Sahara away, then we have to give the Reef away, has almost become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the state has become so centralized and security focused and neurotic that it's created these conditions of resistance.
So have the Polisario been reaching out to the Berbers, or?
No, it's interesting though. I mean, the Spanish connection is interesting in that sense, but yeah, Polisario isn't interested in undermining the sovereignty of the Moroccan state.
So let me see if there's any other questions here. Should the UN stay, or should it just say we're going and leave them to it?
Well, the UN has prided itself on years for keeping the peace in Western Sahara, which has become sort of like correlation without causation, example number one, which was proven entirely incorrect recently. What was keeping the peace was Sahrawi hopes that there was a viable path forward towards some sort of resolution of the problems they were facing. And Morocco has consistently blocked that. They tried with Chris Ross, who was the previous personal envoy, they tried to persona non grata him several times, finally succeeding in the end after forcing him to resort to shuttle negotiations for several years, which bore no fruit. So yeah, should the UN leave? It's a difficult thing to say. Were the UN to come back, would it be called the UN mission for the referendum in Western Sahara? That would be a significant loss for the Sahrawis. For Morocco, it would be quite an embarrassment because of the fact that the UN mission has been a part of keeping the peace and allowing them to colonize the territory at breakneck pace in recent years.
Well, that's I mean, it's become part of the problem rather than part of the solution.
In many ways, yes, yeah.
Yeah, is anybody advocating measures that that sort of take this into account?
At a high level, this is what we thought John Bolton was maybe doing when he was helping lead the push when Horst Kohler was recently the personal envoy, and the U.S. State Department was taking enhanced interest in the issue. It seemed to be the case that the U.S. was saying, we want a performance-based peace process, and if we don't see results, we're going to terminate the mission, which is perfectly possible for any of the permanent 5 members to do, to just veto it. An interesting prospect, given recent protests by Russia about the extent to which they feel excluded from the resolution writing process.
But I mean, Russia was part of the problem because it used to back Polisario to the hilt, and since then it's traded off with the French and the Moroccans and anybody else it can trade with. It's let's say it's transactional rather than ideological politics now.
Well, the Polisario was always very careful not to be aligned too closely with the Soviet Union. They were much more invested in the third world type movements, that sort of thing. And Russia even had a massive phosphate deal with Morocco in the middle of the war in Western Sahara, which sort of put the lie to the idea that Polisario was a front for the Soviet Union in any way, which is what the Moroccans were, of course, saying. Nowadays, Polisario is the armed wing of Al Qaeda in the Sahara or some nonsense like that.
So, with the now, as they say, are there any outcomes? Is there a military solution? Can Polisario actually defeat the Moroccans, or inflict enough damage on the Moroccans that the Moroccans will say time to go, like the Mauritanians did?
It's difficult to say. The strategic environment isn't all that different than it was in the late 80s, which is that Morocco has this massive defensive wall in the Western Sahara called the berms that's heavily mined and patrolled and has advanced sensing equipment and has bases, every 20 or so kilometers. So Polisario attacks right now are limited to those Moroccan positions on the wall, exactly as they were in the 1980s. And so whether or not a kind of war of attrition against the wall can break Moroccan military morale remains to be seen. But from what I've heard from Sahrawi diplomats is that right now they're just engaging in artillery and missile fire, shelling, sort of softening up the Moroccan positions, and then they'll evaluate whether or not to escalate.
Are they actually aiming at Moroccans, or are they aiming at empty positions so they're not too provocative?
Well, they claim to be attacking bases if you look at the reports coming out of the Polisario military arm.
But the Moroccans aren't reporting any casualties.
It's not happening according to Morocco.
This is, it really is a shadow war, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Castles in the sand. One interesting suggestion from Roger Kaplan here. How would you characterize the idea of a broad regional conference to sort out who gets what, including Tuareg, Sahrawi, Berbers from Kabylia, and who don't like the Algerians, allegedly, and whoever else feels concerned? Isn't it an African thing, all sitting down together and talking it through?
Well, that raises questions about whether or not opening up territorial questions cause more problems than they solve. That, is Algeria really willing to put Saharan territory on the table to free Western Sahara? Will Niger give up the uranium mines near Arlit to satisfy the Tuaregs? Things like that. That just seems like you're complicating an issue that right now needs a lot more focus and a lot less mess. These efforts to kind of multilateralize an issue that's really bilateral, it's between Western Saharans and Morocco, right? That almost fits in more with a Moroccan scheme to say that, this is a dispute between Algeria and Morocco when Algeria has no territorial claim at all.
We're really, it is a quandary because it is an international issue, because there's a major issue of international principle. There are Security Council resolutions which are being flouted on a daily basis for 40 years. The Moroccan government, even as flagrantly as Israel in the West Bank, is cocking a snook at international legitimacy. The ICJ has ruled, and it's very similar, by the way, even down to the dividing, even down to the wall. I keep making the parallel. But this one doesn't raise nearly as much fuss. But there is a major issue of principle. Can we walk away from it without, in a sense, undermining the foundations of the post-war world order with the United Nations?
Yeah, and when you see recent sort of slippages in that order, and you wonder where it came from, and you have to begin to think about, well, what are the cases that we've let slide? Where are the cases where states were allowed to change borders through force? Cases like East Timor, cases like Palestine, cases like West Papua,
Ukraine, Georgia,
Ukraine, right? So who's to blame for the disintegration of international order when it's been the North Atlantic powers who've abided by these acts of aggression in Palestine and Western Sahara, right? So yeah, there's certainly something very much is at stake. The UN system that was created to prevent the act of aggression, right? The primary crime that we put the Nazis on trial for.
Kathleen Thomas has said, wouldn't it be better for the Sahrawis, for the Security Council to renounce its interest in the issue and to hand it over to the General Assembly to look after?
Possibly, yeah. There you might get a more receptive audience, especially in terms of self-determination and that sort of thing. Keeping the issue within the Security Council might actually be one of these mechanisms, right? The things that keep the conflict going. And so, yeah, in the or General Assembly, where you actually originally got the statements where that designated Western Sahara occupied territory, right? So that might actually be an interesting move. But then if the Security Council seems very reluctant, and if DPKO seems very reluctant, then you'll kind of understand why they want to hold on to an institution that's not able to solve a problem.
Yes, and why does that institution want to stay in there when it can't do anything?
Yeah,
and it's costing it $50 million a year,
yeah.
And sort of debriding its legitimacy with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Well, I think have you got any bright thoughts to end up as
No, I'm just gonna watch the situation, see how it evolves. I have no predictions at this point.
Okay, well, this is I think we certainly haven't solved the problem. Where
No.
I think we've just got overawed with the fact that the problem seems to be more insoluble each way we look at it.
Yeah.
But the principles are clear, and the key question is: can Morocco be persuaded to obey international law and its own promises? That's the people keep forgetting. 4 promises to hold a referendum so far. So this is Ian Williams, president of the Foreign Press Association. We have this is our latest webinar. We have more coming up soon. I should report, disturbingly, we were going to have one on Hong Kong, but we couldn't find any legislator who was prepared to talk to us for fear of being arrested by dealing with foreign powers, following the affairs this week. So we didn't really feel it was necessary to get people arrested by the PRC for speaking to us. And we're certainly not going to risk people's lives on this issue either at the moment. But thank you very much, Jacob Mundy. I hope we come back. I very much hope, well, I don't know, if things hot up over the next few weeks, we will have you back and get your ear to the sand to hear the camels humping across the desert or whatever they do late at night, and we'll find out what's happening more. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you from the Foreign Press Association of the USA, and do keep a look on our website, see what future delights we hold for your education, and so we can solve the world's problems. And by all means, donate to our various efforts, our awards and impending scholarships. Coming up, by the way, we're hoping to have an award for the best foreign coverage of the United States. We're looking for support on that. Feel free to join us. Thank you very much, everybody.